Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's best books. I'm your host, Erik Larson, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 52 books per year and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each book. Today I'm going to cover The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson, a saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz. This is book 50 of 52 for my 2022 reading list. Well, as the subtitle for this one would suggest, this is a book about the Nazi bombing, the Nazi Blitz of London during the time of Churchill. The time covered is from May 10th, 1940, which is the day that Churchill became prime minister, and it goes through pretty much through the end of 1941 with a heavy focus on the early part of 1941. So in that time, London and other parts of Britain are regularly getting bombed by the Nazis at night by the air, and this is referred to as the Blitz. Also, as stated in that subtitle, this book covers Churchill, so his leadership, his family, so some love stories and different things like that going on with his family during these battles, and then defiance. And we see defiance both in Churchill, but then also in Britain to a larger extent. And that was one of the words I thought of a lot while reading this book, defiance, but then also resilience, the resiliency of the people, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then the other word I kept writing in the margins was wow, and mostly because this was a lot of things that I learned a lot, and there were just so many crazy tidbits of information in this book that I over and over I kept writing wow, and I love when I do that in a book because that means I'm learning. It means it's exciting that these are fun things and interesting things to learn about. So that came up quite a bit as well, and that ties into a weird kind of statement I need to make here at the beginning, and that's that I'm going to be giving away spoilers in this book. And that may sound like a very strange thing because we're talking about history here. It's happened. It's kind of out in the open. Yeah, everyone knows a lot of these things. I didn't know a lot of the details that I learned in this book. And so that's why I say this spoiler thing, because especially the way that Erik Larson writes this book is it reads like fiction, like a thriller, like there's and he's introducing things, and you find out what happens at the end to these people or the different ideas and things that he's introducing and then talking about throughout the story. So I'll be giving away spoilers in that sense of like, this is what happened to this particular person by the end. So if you don't want to learn that, I would just hit pause here and go ahead and read the book first. So yes, that's strange to give a spoiler warning for a nonfiction work, but just in the way that Erik Larson writes, you get that sense of you wanna know what happens to these people. So another thing that makes this book very exciting. I love too that Erik Larson just kept talking about Churchill's family. I mean, you learn a lot about Churchill, you learn a lot about his associates, but then you also learn about his family and some of the inner demons, some of the love stories, and so yes, you're in the midst of this war. There are bombings, there are people dying almost nightly, and just this sense of this all could end tomorrow, yet life goes on and love goes on and all these different things. So a lot of kind of side stories that weave within the pages of this book. The title of the book comes from a statement made by John Colville, who is assistant private secretary to Winston Churchill during this time, and he also kept a diary, and so he had a lot of interesting thoughts about Churchill that were written down, the day of or a day after about Churchill. So very fresh information, and he made the statement while he was looking out the window, and this came up quite a few times in the book from different people, and there's this horror of the war that's going on and the bombings and all that, and yet there's also this beauty or this astonishment at also what is going on. And so sometimes that would take the idea of nature, like yes, there's these bombings, but like you look past the bombs and the fires going, and there's nature, or there's just this beautiful sky or something like that. So the contrast with war, with nature, but then also just the contrast of the beauty of the destruction too, which is an odd thing to say, but you're looking at a scene that where all these bombs are being dropped, but there's these fires that kind of light the sky, and there's this odd beauty within this horrible destruction. And so John Colville's looking out his window, and he sees the night sky, he sees the beauty of this dark night, but then there's these just planes, and so many planes coming over. And that's what you get in looking at the cover of this book as well. But here's the statement he made. He said, "Never was there such a contrast of natural splendor and human vileness." And so that's where we get the splendid and the vile, the title of this book. This is the second book I've read by Larson. In 2019, I read The Devil in the White City for this project, for my 2019 reading list. That was another book that was hard to put down. And so of the two books by Larson that I've read, I guess the thing that's really neat is, yes, there's kind of this main story going on, but there's also these other pieces going on. So you learn a lot. You learn a lot about different things, and they're really exciting books the way he writes them. I've bought a couple other Erik Larson books, so I do hope to read them at some point. As for reading stats, this is a 503-page book. At least the hardcover edition is. And that took me 13 hours and 50 minutes to read through it. That was over a period of 15 days, so that averaged 34 pages per day. And I read it between November 29 and December 13th. So there'll be two more segments to this episode after this one. Segment 2, I'll cover a few interesting things that I learned. And then in segment 3, I'll cover the one thing, my one key takeaway from The Splendid and the Vile. Well, if this is a book you think you would be interested in reading, I would ask you to purchase it from Landmark Booksellers in Franklin, Tennessee. I'm the business manager there, and that would be the best way that you can support this podcast. So I'll link to it in the show notes, and if you use the coupon code Books of Titans, that'll give you 10% off of this book. Real quick, one other comment here. It was very neat to read this book after reading The Viking Heart. And that's the book that I covered in last week's podcast episode. So I read Viking Heart, and then this book was right after that one. And in the Viking Heart, there's some parts about World War II, and parts that I learned about there that I read about also in The Splendid and the Vile. So I love when that happens. I love when the books are back to back like that, and you're able to take the stuff you learned from two different books, and since it was so close together, it was even more memorable in that sense. So here are three things that I found interesting and that I learned in this book. And the first was that word resiliency, and the defiance, but really resiliency. And resiliency is the word that I kept writing over and over in the margins as well. And it amazed me because I think the thing that struck me the most was just how life went on. You've seen that notice, the stay calm and carry on that is on all sorts of things that from Britain. But that's the idea you get here. There would be all-night bombings, and so people are not sleeping. There's just constant noise, and there's anti-aircraft guns going off. So whether it's you're getting woken up from the bombs or the guns shooting at the planes that are bombing you, you're up most of the night with the noise and fear of a bomb hitting where you are. And by the next morning, people are up. They're on their way to work. They're going to work. They're taking the train if the train's still running, and life just goes on. And that's such an odd thing to think about. I mean, if we started getting bombed, if my neighborhood started getting bombed, or my city, I don't think we would just go on as normal. And maybe after a while you would have to keep things going. And I'm sure a lot of people were working in industries that were required just in terms of weaponry and that sort of thing. But it was just so startling. And even some of the worst bombings, they'd use incendiary bombs where it's just creating fires all over the place. And this is going on the entire night. And then it would be one of the most devastating bombing attacks by the Nazis. And then people wake up the next morning and just go about life. And that was very startling and astonishing as I read this. And so I want to read just a few sections, and this from page 429. He went back to his own flat and tried to sleep, but after an hour he gave up. Nearby detonations caused the buildings to shudder and sent shrapnel clattering against his windows. He climbed to his roof, and there was met by the most amazing sight I've ever seen in my life. A whole section of the city north of the financial district was a solid mass of flames, leaping hundreds of feet into the air. I'm skipping forward a little bit here now. Nearby at Claridge's Hotel, General Lee, the American military attaché, now back in London, went down to the first floor room of a member of the U.S. Embassy's diplomatic staff, Herschel Johnson. As bombs fell and fires burned, they discussed literature, mainly the works of Thomas Wolfe and Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. The conversation shifted to Chinese art. Herschel brought out a collection of fine porcelain objects. All this time, Lee wrote, I had the sickening feeling that hundreds of people were being murdered in a most savage way, almost within a stone's throw, and there was nothing to do about it. End quote. So just that idea, there's bombs going off. They're discussing literature amidst these bombs. I guess just at some point they realized there was nothing they could do, and they just tried to go on as normal. Amazing. Second thing I learned and found very interesting was the information and stories about Rudolf Hess. And Rudolf Hess was the number 3 guy in the Nazi regime. And I didn't know any of this. I'm sure you know this, but he flew he got it to where he had his own plane, and he knew how to pilot it, and he snuck into Scotland. Like, he flew from Germany to Scotland. This is a time where there's almost nightly raids from Germany. So the fact that he didn't get shot down is just, first off, incredible. And he was going to Scotland to get near Glasgow in an attempt to meet with a certain person to broker a peace deal. So this, like, Hitler did not know about this. No one else know. Like, he just did this on his own. Flew to Scotland, was immediately taken prisoner. Like, I mean, he had to eject out of his plane. He gets on the ground, gives a fake name, but they realize who he is pretty quickly, and they capture him. The peace deal thing does not move forward at all, but and he's imprisoned, and then he dies in prison in his 90s. But just the whole story, the way Erik Larson writes about it, and you're like, how could this have happened? Like, here's this high up Nazi guy, and he lands in Scotland, and then there's someone in England who has a dream about something like this happening, and a high ranking official landing in England, and it's just crazy. But I didn't know any of that history, but it's amazing. But this Hess spent the rest of his life in prison and died in prison there as well. Now, the final thing that stood out to me and that I learned in this book was just this odd thing with Goebbels, another high-ranking in the person in charge of propaganda for the Nazis. And he was super concerned about moral decay while he was part of this atrocity of decimating a whole group of people and killing millions of people. He was concerned about the moral decay happening in Germany, especially with strip dancers. And so he didn't mind the whole murdering of millions of people, but he was very concerned about this other thing. And it was just so odd to read that. And it comes up a lot in the books, and it's just I don't know, like you watch some movies or read some books, and the evil person is absolutely evil. And there's just this like abandonment of all morality. And it's just, all the way, they're just all the way evil. But that's not how it is. Like, that's not how people are. And most of the people committing these just atrocious acts, they don't necessarily think that they're doing evil. They've got some sort of a moral thing going on in their head, like that they're doing the right thing or or they're on the right path. And that's even scarier. Like that's not comforting. It's almost easier to imagine people just being absolute evil. There's the complete abandonment of morality, but that's not the case. And this was just such an odd thing to read about, with a high-ranking Nazi, and he's concerned about strip dancers while murdering millions of people. That's just, it's hard to even fathom that going on in someone's head, but it did. And you read about it in this book. Now on to segment 3, and the one thing, my one key takeaway from the Splendid and the Vile. Well, the cool thing about this book is that you're getting a number of different vantage points, and you're hearing and seeing what some of the top leadership for the Nazis, what they were writing in their journals, their private thoughts, not just what they were sharing with others, but their own private thoughts. You're getting that on the British side as well. You're getting a lot of this information, and then just all put together. And what you see is that the defiance of Churchill was a huge factor in this war. It wasn't expected. So especially after France fell, the Nazis thought Britain would do the same, that they would seek a peace arrangement, and it would be easy. It would be over very quickly. And Churchill from day one said no. I believe Erik Larson talks about one part where Churchill kind of gave thought to this potential for trying to broker a peace with the Nazis, but it was just once, and that was it. All the other times, it was speaking of victory, it was speaking of no surrender, and there was a defiance that they were not going to back down. If you bomb us, we will bomb you. And that defiance shifted the whole war. And it shifted, you see it over and over in this book, it shifted the Nazi mindset. Like they were not expecting this. They thought they could just kind of roll over everyone. And here's a man saying no. And he did it from the beginning. He stood by that. He set that boundary, and he stuck with it, and it changed everything. I think about Zelensky now in Ukraine, and no matter what you think about him, his defiance changed the game for Russia. I don't think they were expecting that, and Zelensky had a ticket out. I think the U.S. said they would fly him out, and he said no, and that changed everything. And so you have this idea of a person saying no to what seems like an inevitable loss. He says, "No, I'm sticking here. We're going to fight to the last person," and that just changed everything. All these other countries are falling like dominoes around Germany, but Britain held strong. And you see the toll in this book. You see the bombings. You see the devastation. You see the lives lost. You read descriptions of what it was like. I can't even imagine, but you're reading about this. I thought a lot about book 1 that I read this year, On Reading Well, by Karen Swallow Prior, and she talks about the virtues, and she talks how a virtue is kind of a middle point. It's a balance between two extremes. So if you're thinking of Churchill as a courageous person, well, the virtue is courage, but on either side of that virtue, there's one side that goes to cowardice, and then there's the other side that would go to recklessness. And you know this about Churchill, like he would go on the roof during bombings, and he would watch it. And I'm going to read a section here just in a minute, but where they talk a little bit about that. And so you could look at that and you could say that was very reckless. That was not courageous, but that was reckless. But I like to think that was more courage. And he would go, after a bombing, he would go to the place at great personal risk to him. He would go to the place that had just been bombed to be there with the people and to talk to them. And that courage was a turning point as well. So you've got the defiance first off, and that's my one thing, just this defiance of Churchill and how that shifted everything. But then you've got his courage. That's part of that defiance, and it's probably the main force behind that defiance. And so while I was reading it, I thought of a couple what if scenarios. And the first what if scenario is one that a lot of people have thought about. But the other one was something that I just thought about, especially in thinking about On Reading Well by Karen Swallow Prior. So the first what if scenario is Churchill's he appears to be reckless. So he's going up on buildings during bombings. One bomb would have taken him out. So what if Churchill had been killed by one of these bombs? The thinking on the Nazi side is that a weaker leader, a weaker prime minister would have taken his place, that the Nazis could have then done a quote peace deal with, and then that would have neutralized Britain. So someone else would have done a deal with Hitler. So what would history have been like? So that's the what if scenario. What would history have been like had Britain capitulated and a weak prime minister had come in? What if? That's what if number one. But here's another what if to consider. What if just that defiance and that courage that Churchill showed, what if that increased the level of courage in his country to where, had he been killed, the overall courage in the country would have made leaders of higher courage, would have led to a country of higher courage, to where a replacement would have had the same courage that Churchill had? What if just that risking of his self, what if that was a very humble way of saying, I know I'm not the only person? And I don't know if Churchill thought this, but what if that was more of just that showing that courage inspired an entire country and an entire people, to where if he had been killed, then someone else would have stepped up with that increased level of courage, just by encouraging them, giving them courage by his actions. What if that changed the game? As opposed to him just sitting in a bunker, doing everything way underground and not having that same level of courage in that sense. Would that have, on the other hand, weakened the country to where, had he been killed, then it was likely that no one would have had the courage that he had in his place? It's just a fun thing to think about. Like if somebody is defiant like that, they say no, and that inspires other people in a like manner. Does that just kind of raise the overall level of courage for a country? And is that the reason that Britain as a whole was defiant? As I said in the beginning, yes, the defiance, the word, it can be said about Churchill, but then it also applied to Britain. It applied to their resiliency. They're continuing on. They're going on with life. They're staying calm and carrying on. What if that was all kind of started from that courage of Churchill? Just a fun thing to think about. Let me read this really quickly. This is page 405. So a few parts here. And this is when there's some people from the U.S. there at this point who are with Churchill. And so here we go. Dinner proceeded as if no raid were occurring. After the meal, Biddle told Churchill that he would like to see for himself the strides which London had made in air raid precautions. At which point, Churchill invited him and Harriman to accompany him to the roof. The raid was still in progress. Along the way, they put on steel helmets and collected John Colville and Eric Seal so that they too, as Colville put it, could watch the fun. Churchill and his helmeted entourage stayed on the roof for 2 hours. All the while, Biddle wrote in a letter to President Roosevelt, he received reports at various intervals from the different sections of the city hit by the bombs. It was intensely interesting. End quote. So yeah, Churchill just go on the roof at different times to watch these bombs, keeping an eye on how things are going, getting reports on what's happening. But he was not in the bunker where he could have easily been, but he was up there on top. And I think that courage and that leadership inspired a nation. So to recap, this is a very exciting and informative book about a roughly 1.5 year time period of World War II. This would actually make a great holiday gift. I gave this to my dad last year, and he really enjoyed this book. But if you need a good gift idea, this is a fun and exciting book. At its core, it's a book about resiliency and defiance. So what do you do in the midst of overwhelming odds that are stacked against you, stacked against your country, against your company, against your family? And then how does courage in a leader inspire those around him or her? Is a leader's primary role to do it all themselves, or is it to be thinking about how to inspire others to take on the mantle should they no longer be around? There's a lot of neat questions that just come up as you're reading this, but yeah, just that one thing that sticks out above all is the courage of Churchill and how that transformed the nation, how it intimidated the Nazis that thought that this was just going to be easy. One thing I wish the book had was photos. I mean, obviously you can get on Google and see them, but I just like when photos are in the books to know who you're reading about. So to see photos of the people that are the main people in the book, but then also just to see photos of maybe the planes that are being talked about or the aftermath, seeing buildings bombed out. There was one photo at the very beginning of the book, and I actually liked this photo a lot because it's a photo of three men standing in a room full of books, and they're looking at the books, and there's just a pile of material in the middle of the room. There's just books strewn all over the floor, and yet there's still a number of books on the shelves, and then there's no roof to the building. So the roof's been bombed out, but life goes on. It just shows that resiliency. There's this desire for books, for literature, for reading amidst this like horror of the war. So it was a perfect image to show there, but I do wish there had been books throughout or photos throughout the book as well. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you've read The Splendid and the Vile. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. Please buy this book from the link in the show notes, and then use Books of Titans for 10% off. You can follow me at Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and you can also go to the website and see a lot of information about creating a reading list. You can see my past reading lists and just some helpful tips on reading and remembering what you read. I'll be back in a week or two to discuss another book from this year's reading project and 2022 reading list. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.